Jensen Cummings here. Thank you as always for tuning in. Today is Best Served Podcast 269, and we're talking about evaluating your four walls. This is Best Served New Volume 1 with Meta Asian Kitchen, Episode 7 of 10. And this is going to be about real estate, but really your four walls, understanding what it means in any type of location that you're getting yourself into. And we have an understanding somewhat of what the four walls of a typical restaurant looks like. In today's age, we're seeing a lot of different iterations of what a restaurant actually looks like. And so all of you know, Ken and Doris, the Meta Asian, are in Avanti, a food hall concept. So for them, the start of their restaurant journey started not in a prototypical restaurant. And I think there's something to dig into there. So we're going to get into that. And as you know, this whole series has been about Ken and Doris, their personal journey, really giving them some coaching, allowing all of you to be a part of that journey a little bit, to both siphon some superpowers and get to know Ken and Doris, because this is a human business. We are all about hospitality, creating experiences and moments for them, sharing their culture and heritage. And we really want to be able to put that on a pedestal more than anything else, because we know, and I talk about it all the time, the industry standards, love my air quotes, are so arcane and in many places so broken, they just don't serve the individuals that actually work and operate in this industry. And so we really want to dissect that. And you can check every single box that you're supposed to and still fail at that unbelievably high rate of 60% of restaurants closing in the first 12 months. So you hear me talk a lot about the 73% turnover rate. These are huge vulnerabilities that we want to kind of go at. So that's what this series has been about. And Ken and Doris want to bring you guys in now. Good to see you as always. Good morning.
Good morning.
Hello.
All right. So we're getting near the end of this series. We've gone through a lot through this, a lot. Your story, your heritage, the way that we are menu costing, the way that we're developing your menu, the language that we're using, right? How you invest in people, compliance. And then we get to real estate. Real estate is such a struggle for us because it's a completely different language. We don't understand it. Typically, it's big numbers when we're talking about how much it takes to invest in a space, and we're impatient. This is a big thing. We are impatient. We are instant gratification. Ken can knock out an order in a couple minutes, yet this process can take 6, 9, 12, 15 months, and it's hard for us. And so we start to get a little antsy. I know this for myself, where I'm like, let's just go. Yeah, it's fine. And we start to make concessions for things that we should not be. We start to trick ourselves into thinking, yeah, it'll be fine. I think that's okay. Let's just make it work. Let's just get in there. And now you are committed to 10 years of a potentially bad deal. And the bad deal may just because we didn't understand what deal we were trying to make. All right. So we're really going to dig into that today. And I know you've had a lot of frustrations. Everybody has a lot of frustrations because we're getting into something that is completely unique and different. For the two of you, what I appreciate is that the food hall as the first step was great, because it doesn't put you $250,000 in debt, right? It allows you an opportunity to really test this thing out, to hone yourself. Now the two of you are also going into a virtual kitchen, right? Which is exciting for you. Breaking news, everybody. And so that for the two of you was another step for you to think about takeout and delivery and how you express your brand that way, how you build up some more history of that brand, how you start to define your brand in a different way that then gives you an opportunity. Now you've taken 2 steps before you get to real estate. I think is very smart. Why was that a decision that you wanted to make?
You know, with the pandemic going on and everything, we really thought that this wasn't a good time to continue our search to look for a retail space, which I think is a good decision considering we're basically shutting down again starting tomorrow at 5 p.m. And also because Avanti doesn't allow us to do delivery out of their space, because they're more of a bar, they want people to come into the restaurant. So when we were reached out to by this company to go into their virtual kitchen, we did the tour and we felt like, you know what, this is another great step into helping us growing our brand virtually. we'll sign ourselves on all these platforms, offer delivery, then we can reach a bigger audience, the audience outside of Avanti.
And then you're on a 6-month, which still gives you some runway to then look at the real estate side in a timely manner for you. And now you have 2 entities that are pushing you out into the market, establishing the brand, generating some sales, and diversifying as well.
Right.
Because we don't understand delivery as much. We don't want to pay for that. Like there's a lot of things that we're having to learn on the fly about third party and delivery, as well as that is accelerated massively. So really appreciate that. All right. I want to bring in Amy Escala from Mesner Reeves, attorney. Amy, good to see you again, as always.
Nice to see you. Hi, guys.
All right. Amy, Ken and Doris. Hi. Amy is going to break down some of the terminology that just, right? It's explained to us multiple times. We go, yeah, I get it. And then we go, I don't get it. Okay. And so we're going to break down some of those terms as we go here. And just to let everyone know, Amy is going to give you some insights, not legal advice. Okay. I want to make sure and make that stipulation. This is not legal advice. This is just a helping hand in somebody who has looked at hundreds of leases and really understands this. So I want to start, Amy, with something that you see coming across the table when you're interacting through your broker and the landlord, the LOI, right? First of all, I don't know what an LOI meant when I first heard that. The letter of intent, I still didn't know what that meant once it was defined for me. Outlines terms of prospective sales before buyer commits to purchase. Great. That sounds great. What does that actually mean? What is happening in that exchange with the LOI?
So essentially an LOI provides the meat of the business terms for the lease that you are about to enter into. Generally, LOIs are not binding documents, meaning you can't bind someone by saying, well, you agreed to it in the LOI, judge, and therefore you should rule in my favor. That said, it's seen as very poor form to go against what you've agreed to in an LOI, because at the end of the day, what you're doing is essentially setting up the framework for your lease. Now, of course, you can't put everything in the kitchen sink in an LOI in terms of what you're looking for or what the landlord is looking for, but these are your major points, your contingencies, your rental figures, your build out, landlord's work obligations, things that you need to get out of the way to be able to move forward to make a deal. Essentially, what I tell clients, if you're not comfortable with the deal points in the LOI, there's no point in negotiating a lease, because if you can't agree on these terms now, you're not going to be able to do it when you move on to a 70-page lease where you're negotiating other terms on top of these big business points. So see an LOI as what you're agreeing to in the lease. Don't see it as something where I just want to sign this and get going and we can backtrack later. Because again, although it's typically not binding, it's seen as poor form to try to go back and renegotiate what you said in the LOI. That said, it happens. Circumstances can change. Time goes on. I mean, I've seen LOIs executed and a lease isn't even started until 7 months later. And at that point, some things have changed. So it's not to say that things can't change from the LOI, but again, if you're not comfortable with what's in the LOI, don't move forward, because it's going to be a waste of your time and a waste of landlords. So really, really focus in with your broker to make sure you're comfortable and understand everything that's contained in the LOI. If you're confused, you can certainly call your attorney. But for the most part, in terms of rental amounts and other certain location-specific items, that's going to be more of a broker question, because they're familiar with the atmosphere, with the climate of what's going on in that location and things like that. But just be very comfortable. Those are your biggest business terms. Don't be intimidated by it by any means, but be comfortable with it.
Yeah, and this is where the patience part comes in. I remember this being like, yeah, let's just get it in there and let's go. Like, let's do this. Let's hustle. I'm not here to like read through paperwork, right? That's not what I do. I want to get back to the kitchen. And so the patience comes in, because you're getting yourself down this path that leads to, again, you're not going to change much once you get to the lease, is typical. And then there's this almost this pressure that's on you. I was like, well, all right, we took the lease and built it from the LOI. This is what it is. And then you go, shit, what do I do now? Like I'm already committed, it feels like. And then to back out of that deal, you know, and then there's a little ego comes into it, and then you put yourself potentially in a vulnerable position. So LOI, super important. Take all the time in the world that it takes on your LOI, get that dialed, absolutely, and understanding the next terms are important. So NNN, I love this. This is like, what does NNN mean? Triple net. I know this is a pet peeve of yours, Amy. So break it down for us. What is triple net?
Triple net in its truest sense means the tenant is going to pay for every cost and expense in relation to a premises. You typically see a true triple net in a ground lease where truly there is no landlord maintenance obligation. Landlords simply kick their feet up and collect a rent check. It's more of an investment opportunity for them. So I think the term triple net NNN is very overused. Most inline multi-tenant buildings are not triple net, even though the LOI or brokers or landlords will like to say that. At the end of the day, they're probably single or double net, meaning you're going to pay your share of taxes, you're going to pay your share of insurance, and you're going to pay some maintenance in relation to the property, but you are not going to pay every single amount that comes through, which is what a true triple net is. So you know that the meme of the guy sprinkling salt? I feel like that's what the triple net is used everywhere. It's so overused. It's that guy.
This guy.
Triple net. Everyone talking about triple net. Very rarely is a triple net lease a triple net lease. So when you see it, take it with a grain of salt. It pretty much means that the landlord is going to want to pass through costs to you, which is standard. But a true triple net lease, in its very basic sense of the word, it's you're not going to see it in an inline multi-tenant building.
And so what you're talking about now brings us to next, CAM, right? Because that's then where it's actually a double net with you're paying CAM as well, which kind of is part of triple net, but you're not paying the entirety of it. So CAM, again, this is something the first time that I saw a property with the TAG restaurant group, I was like, they were like, so the CAM charges cover the sewage and this and that and the other. And I was like, oh, that sounds reasonable. That sounds about right. And I literally walked out and had to Google it because I was too embarrassed to say I have no idea what CAM means. And that's a huge vulnerability, right? Like we do have this sometimes fake it till you make it mentality in the restaurant because there's so much social pressure. And then you go into real estate and there's another layer of stuff I don't understand. Well, I'm not going to be the idiot. I'm here to, build my dream restaurant. So CAM for me was that huge thing where I just recognized like, I'm in way over my head. I don't understand what I'm doing. So CAM, what specifically should they expect from CAM?
I think to understand CAM, you have to understand common areas. And common areas are portions of a shopping center that are provided by a landlord for the common use of tenants, customers, their employees, like drive aisles, parking lots, sidewalks, landscaping, areas of a larger shopping center that aren't specifically one tenant's premises, but rather for the use of all tenants. So essentially with these areas, landlords typically maintain them and they'll take all of those costs and then they'll divvy out a proportionate share of those costs to the tenants. Typically and most often, the proportionate share is based upon the rentable square footage of your premises versus the rentable square footage of the entire center. Sometimes this changes. If you find a center with a lot of office use and restaurant use, some of the costs, for example, trash, a restaurant user is going to use a lot more trash and recycling than an office space. So sometimes in some instances, landlords will want to divide these differently amongst different tenants. But for the most part, you're going to be paying a proportionate share of your space versus all of the rentable square footage in the center. This is something that I like to talk about in relation to an LOI because I think like Jensen and a lot of people, they kind of brush off these costs thinking, oh, they're standard and therefore I have to pay them and I have no control over them. And I think people get themselves into, a bit of trouble because these costs can be pretty extensive. And like pretty much every term in a lease, common area maintenance is negotiable. What I like to recommend clients do in their LOI stages is to push for a first year cap on CAM or at minimum a cap moving forward. I think that predictable common area maintenance is great for tenants' books. You know what's coming in the next year. You know how high it can go or how low it can go. And when you have a cap, there's a lot less negotiation in terms of what can and cannot be included in CAM. So that's something I usually recommend making sure you at least try to get included in the LOI because it'll help you anticipate your costs better for your pro forma and then for years moving forward. Landlords won't always agree to it, and that's okay. But if that's the case, then, be very cautious and try to negotiate what costs can and can't be included in CAM as part of the lease negotiation.
Yeah, and another thing to point out, and this is uncommon, especially if you have a great broker, which you do, right? And if you have a good attorney that is covering you as well. But there have been instances that I've heard about and interacted with where a landlord is waiting for new tenants to come in to fix a whole bunch of potholes that have needed to be fixed for quite a long time, and they're looking to fill and have 100% occupancy within their locations, within all their units, to then pass that cost on to the tenants coming in, even though the impact of that happened prior to them becoming a tenant. So that's why you just need to understand it. Because again, that's sleazy as hell, and it doesn't happen that often. Yet
Sure.
you need to be aware of what's going to be included in that CAM, and to look at your space to see if there are the necessities for any improvements, would then potentially come into things like the TI, right? The potential for improvements happening within your space specific to your needs, and or the common area as well, specific to you coming into that location. And so TI, break that down a little bit for us. Again, another thing that's hard to understand exactly what that means. Who's paying what and why, and who owns what and how. So
So TIA, tenant improvement allowance, there's a lot of different terms. Is a pre-negotiated amount with a tenant and a landlord that a landlord will typically essentially reimburse a tenant for certain construction costs that they incurred. TI, you don't always get it in a lease, particularly if you have a build to suit by a landlord who does a lot of your work for you. Very rarely are you going to get reimbursed for TI. If you're taking a space as is, that's probably an instance in which you would see a lot higher of a TI amount, because you are taking on a lot of that construction and work yourself. Some landlords are, they don't really care what you do with the money. You negotiate it up front. It can be a flat amount. It can be tied to square footage. And when they give it to you, they just give it to you. Some are very specific in that they want you to prove that you used your TI dollars to benefit their property with permanent improvements. So they don't want you buying dishwashers and things that your tables and chairs and furniture and fixtures that you're going to be taking with you when you leave. They're going to want to see you improving the floor or putting in hoods, things that you're going to leave, upgrading the HVAC, things like that. So when you negotiate your TI, I think make sure you look at the caveats that landlords are putting on this amount, because if a landlord says, I'll give you $1 million in TI, but you have to use it for permanent improvements. I mean, there's only so much you can use that towards. So you don't be blinded by this high amount if it's very limited. And, a lot of times a good indicator is you'll see something that says TI an amount up to, and that's when you need to take a step back and say, okay, well, what can I use it for and what can't I use it for? When you negotiate TI, that kind of usually will play into what work landlord does. It'll play into your rental amounts. So everything kind of works together. Some landlords are very free, willing to give TI. Some, as just a business issue, they do not. So don't expect it, but ask for it. The worst they're going to say is no.
Yeah, and I think what's important is it's a reimbursal. All right, so sometimes we get caught up like, wow, they're going to give us all this money to build out this space, and we can do exactly what we want. We can have the floors we want. We can have the finish on the walls that we want. We can put up that cool wall divider that we want. And yes, you potentially can, except it's a reimbursement. So when you're managing cash flow in the startup phase, this is very, very important, right? And a lot of times you get yourself upside down at that point, and then you're so far down a certain project, and it always takes longer, costs more money, right? And so all of a sudden you've exceeded that amount, but you're already 2/3 the way in. You then cover that cost, and then you have an additional $22,000 cost that you weren't expecting, right? And then when we get to the end, that is always the most important to me, employees, we're like, we have no money left to hire people, and then you're negotiating people down to the amount you can afford, and then we're losing staff, right? So this is where at the front end, again, I make fun of the light fixtures reclaimed from the Titanic, and we spent $2,200 on each of them, and now we're over budget, right? This is an important thing to really understand. So appreciate that. TI can look like, wow, I get $100,000. Slow down. Slow down and make sure you really understand what that means.
Yeah, we actually saw a space where a landlord was offering like a high amount of TI, but then we realized there's a lot of work that needed to be required. So it's just like, was it really like beneficial for us to receive such a high amount of TI? And when in reality, it went to just, reinvesting into the space, and then it was on us to execute the work. The landlord doing it himself.
Yeah. Yeah, you definitely have to just be aware of it. Who and how, is it for you an opportunity to do exactly what you want to do? Or is it an additional burden that you're having to manage? And all of a sudden now you have to get good at managing construction and design costs and architecture costs and FF&E costs. That is not, again, things that you're good at, right? We're just not good at that. So I think that's an important thing to really understand. There are other people. I think of Frank Bonanno, who's told me multiple times, he's like, I take all of the TI. I try to have everything go into that space without me spending any money, because he has a system to do that. So for him, that's what he's negotiating every single time. For you, probably different. Frank has a team. They know exactly what to do. Jacqueline Bonanno is a designer, so they really understand how to manage that. For them, it works really, really well. They have a low output of cash on the front end for themselves. So really important to understand. All right, one last piece. Force majeure. This is this boilerplate thing that in 25, 30 leases I had never seen changed. It is the act of God clause. And now it is being negotiated for the first time ever that I've seen, again, in restaurant leases. Break that down for us. What does it mean, the force majeure clause?
Well, I can tell you I've said force majeure more this year than I ever have in my entire life. Yeah. Force majeure, in its general sense, is a clause that excuses performance for unforeseen circumstances that causes a party to be able to not perform or delay in their performance of certain obligations. It's important to understand up front that generally payment of rent or other money under a lease is not included in force majeure, which is, I think, a lot of the disappointment that people are seeing this year, because, they thought, oh, cool, well, we have force majeure, and pandemic is certainly an act of God, and therefore we're fine. But unfortunately, generally, force majeure language does not cover the payment of rent. So, yeah, I mean, as Jensen mentioned, this used to be a provision we honestly just kind of skimmed over. It was not negotiated. You never changed it. Basically, every lease from the East Coast to the West Coast to Colorado, office leases, restaurant leases, they were all the same. And now this is quickly becoming one of the most negotiated provisions in our new leases, to the point where some of our clients are even putting their preferred force majeure language in their LOI to get landlords to at least see what they're expecting and what they're hoping for in terms of what's going on. At the end of the day, I hope we never have to deal with this again. But, we've learned in a crash course that things like force majeure are important to negotiate. What we're seeing as a trend for this one is to protect yourselves in the build-out stage. In the event you are only able to open for takeout and delivery at a limited capacity, and then in the event you're fully required to close. It's quickly becoming a very important lease provision, and it's something that you should work with your broker, with the landlord, with your attorney to understand what would happen in every instance and what your rights and obligations are in those instances as well.
Yeah, and the language specifically being built in that I keep seeing is COVID is on every single one, the actual terminology, and then government mandated shutdown. These are the two sets of terms that then lead to certain expectations within that clause. So be hyper aware of that. If there's a boilerplate one on there, you need to make sure. And most people now are building that in ahead of time. You're not having to build that in. It's starting to become a new boilerplate, but just make sure you're super, super aware of that. Last thing, while we have Amy, something Ken and Doris, you asked, we don't do this enough. We don't want to pay lawyers. We don't like it. They charge too much an hour. And you know what? I have seen it time and time again. The bill always comes due. We just wait till everything's on fire and it costs 10 times as much, when Amy or any attorney could have put you in a better position. And yeah, it would have cost you a couple $1,000s on the front end. You got to make sure, bring your attorney in way earlier than you think, at the very beginning. And what you really want to do when you start this process is make sure that you have your attorney and your broker on the same page. And if those two are on the same page, you have a strong team behind you to make sure that you're in the right position. And so I think that's very, very important. Your attorney and your broker need to have a good relationship, and then both need to be on the same page for you. That's super, super important, because I've seen it. Leases get completely rewritten once your attorney actually looks at it. And that then costs you a significantly higher dollar amount than if you had them connect and meet up and gotten 2 hours of support on the front end. So just be very, very aware of that. Amy, I appreciate you as always for bringing some insight, not legal advice.
Thanks for having me, and good luck moving forward. It was so nice to meet you both.
Nice.
All right, Amy, have a great day. Appreciate it.
Nice to see you, Jensen.
All right. Attorneys are so important. We just we're such rebels. We only think we need attorneys when we're in trouble, right? That's the only time I dealt with attorneys as a kid, right? So you need to bring them in. They are on your team. They're there to support you. And trust me, the money that you spend up front is well worth it, because the money you spend on the back end costs you way more. And by then you don't have it, because whatever issue you have at that point, you've put yourself in a position where you're upside down. So really appreciate that. All right. we're going to talk broker now. Bring in Zach Citron from Broad Street, who you've been working with. Zach, good to see you.
Hey.
Hey, Zach.
How's it going? Thanks for having me.
All right. So, Zach, we've been breaking down a lot of the terminology, something that I know you're having to navigate through all the time with tenants. And again, restaurant people always say, yeah, I got it. And we don't. I didn't. And I'm a smart guy. I'm a good operator. I still didn't understand it. So it was important for us to really understand that terminology. What I want to get into a little bit is site selection. So one of the things that Ken and Doris specifically, they got very excited and a little bit tunnel vision about the Rhino neighborhood of Denver, River North neighborhood, because it's the hottest neighborhood. All the cool shit is there. All the great operators are there. All like the fire concepts are there. Meta Asian absolutely would fit in well with what's happening there. We need to dig into the numbers, understand what those are. And so for me, demographics comes up a lot. This is where you start the opportunity to know who your audience is, to kind of break down who they are, what their expectations are, what they have to spend. And so real quick, Ken and Doris, I want to tell you a very quick story about when I opened one of my first restaurants, Slotted Spoon, in the DU neighborhood, like near the first Chipotle, fast casual concept. And we were at a King Soopers shopping center. The King Soopers was the #1 grossing in the state of Colorado, #3 in the region. And so for us, when we looked at the numbers, we're like, wow, that is a lot of foot traffic. That is a lot of money being spent in that area. That is good for us, right? That means we're going to get a lot of butts and seats from the fact that that's the #1 grossing. After a while, I'm just always watching people, and I would sit in my car on my day off because I couldn't leave the restaurant. I would sit in my car and I would just watch. I would watch people, and you notice that people park in the same spot every time they go to the King Soopers because we're creatures of habit, right? And I would notice, like, man, a lot of people come here quite often, and it triggered something in me. And I went in and I started doing what I do. I just asked questions, and I got a junior manager to break down some of their numbers for me. And what she told me was that they're the #1 grossing with the least amount of customers, is basically what it was. What that meant is people go there more often and spend more money. And what that means for a restaurant is people cook at home more in that area. Mm-hmm. So the number that I thought was like gangbusters, we're going to be on fire because we're next to the #1 grossing King Soopers, was the complete opposite. It was the biggest vulnerability. It meant people don't go out to eat at restaurants in that area. So that's why the numbers are important. So I want to set that tone for you. It's easy to romanticize the numbers a little bit. Zach, I want to pitch that to you because the way that you're understanding, digging into the numbers, is so important. What do we need to be thinking about when we're thinking about demographics? What are the different elements that we need to be evaluating, and how are you going about that process to get them, again, into the right space with the right audience?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question, because numbers can be deceiving. I really like your example of the King Soopers. You thought, oh, all this foot traffic, we can't lose. And then when you looked at and studied the demographic, oh, there's all this foot traffic because it's an area where people love to cook, right, and they don't go out to restaurants as much.
Yeah, so I felt real smart that I figured it out, even though it cost us $500,000 to figure that out.
Right, and you wish you would have figured that out on the front end before you signed a lease. So I can't stress enough, when you sign a 5, 7, 10-year commitment, you really, really, really want to know what you're signing up for. So, a lot of people love the 16th Street Mall because it's the #1 tourist destination. They kill it at lunch in normal times with all that office density. But when you study it, locals don't love the 16th Street Mall. So evenings are pretty slow and the rents are 50, 60 bucks a foot. And then when you analyze it, it's tough to make sense of. So I think you really, really, really want to understand what you're signing up for. Doris and Ken, I know we've been kind of focused on Rhino, and you mentioned the term tunnel vision. I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing to be super focused on what you want and what you will be successful at. Yeah. It might take longer to find the perfect spot because we're looking at such a small area, but I think that's a better way to go forward than settle because you just want to get something done. I think you want to understand who's your customer, what are they spending, where are they coming from, and position yourself in a space that allows you to succeed. So what you want to be looking at first is occupancy costs. So I know that's something that Jensen wanted to bring up today is what % of your revenue are you paying towards rent? And what % can you afford to pay towards rent to still be a healthy business? So when you take your base rent and your CAMs, as Amy talked about, and your triple nets, that whole package, you really don't want to be over 8%. In a perfect world, you want that to be about 6% of your sales.
Do I like that?
So that's really what you're striving for, because some people sign up for a lease that you're paying $10,000 a month, and your projected revenue is $1 million a year, and all of a sudden your occupancy costs are more than 10%.
Yeah.
So I think it's important to kind of work backwards in a certain space. What do you think you can make out of that space, and then what can you afford if you're making that amount?
This number is so important. Doris, I saw you scribbling.
Yeah,
Scribble and then bold and then put big circles around it, exclamation points. This is huge, 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 because the industry standard has been 8 to 10%. I love that Zach went to 6. That got me really fired up, because that's going to be the nuanced difference. If you can get yourself to 6.2, 6.7, 6.4 versus 8.1, 9%, and 8 to 10% is what people say. So when you have these boilerplate, like here's your breaking down your forecasted operating budget, when you're in startup mode and you have your pro forma and you're like 10%, great. Well, that puts you in a huge vulnerability again. So that number is important for you to understand. Now, that number is different. This is why I'm never telling somebody it has to be 6% or it has to be 8% or it has to be anything, because where you are, what type of business you have, that matters. You have to reverse engineer all that, because if you're somebody like Josh Nurnberg from Bin 707 in Grand Junction, one of the best restaurants in the state, well, he's at like less than 5% because real estate's really inexpensive there. And so it allows them the opportunity to spend money in other places. So you have to understand where that money is going, and you need to make sure. The only thing I say is you have to be sub 8. If you're,
it also depends on your product type and your business plan. Because if you're a restaurant that's doing 70% of your business in alcohol, your margins on food are going to be much less, and maybe you can afford to be that 10% rent ratio. Where if you're a standard restaurant, that probably wouldn't fly. So also knowing kind of what you're selling and what your labor costs are and food costs are, and kind of understanding the full picture.
That's right. So we're finding our ideal customer, right? And we've been working on evaluating, figuring that out, getting tight, using language then to up the value in the market for our product, to then take the dumplings for the Hong Kong dumplings. I'm just going to start calling them that.
We're calling it Chinatown dumplings now.
Yes, there we go. Let's go. The Chinatown dumpling, 4 for $12. People, go get them right now. So that changes the economics significantly and gives you that opportunity. So very, very important ideal customer, understanding our numbers and our product, the language that we use to communicate and then sell that product, and then putting that into the mode of what does that take when we're looking at our lease. So you really understand your occupancy cost, you understand your CAM, your triple net, which might be double net, but your triple net, whatever that organization of your leases. And we did a good job with the letter of intent at the beginning to make sure we really understood that, right? And then that gives the opportunity to make sure that the numbers match up, not just in here, but on paper, that you can have a critical view of it and be able to evaluate that. So super important. The time, we talked about the impatience, and I like that you said that. Tunnel vision, if you're looking down the right tunnel, absolutely good. So we don't get distracted and we really know that what we're going after. So I really appreciate that. The timing of it, let's touch on that. It's so hard. Yeah, Ken and Doris thought that they would already be open in their
Right.
brick and mortar. I know that they did. And the reality is they're not. And it's frustrating, right? And it's because we want to start selling these Chinatown dumplings in Rhino. Let's go. Like we need that there. And I get it. Give us a realistic expectation of timelines. How do we really set a realistic expectation for anybody? And for Ken and Doris, like if you want to get in the right spot, you have to be patient. It's like a dirty word, patient, for us. So give us a little breakdown of what we can expect.
Yeah, so it's really tough to give a rule of thumb how much time it takes to find a space, because I've closed a deal in 2 weeks and I've closed a deal in 2 years, and it's it's really dependent on a lot of factors. But I would say on average, from a conversation with me, kind of what are you looking for? What neighborhoods do you like? What rent can you afford? From that initial conversation to opening your doors, on average, I would say is a year. I would say it's from that conversation about 3 months to find that perfect place that you're going to love and do really well, and that you could just see yourself in. Another 3 months to negotiate the deal, negotiate the LOI, negotiate the lease, make sure all the business terms are teed up, all the legal language that you're protected on, engaging an attorney like we talked about. And then once you sign the lease, you have probably another 3 months for permitting. City is not super fast right now. With COVID, there's
really
forever. With COVID, there's actually a little less in their pipeline.
Right.
So maybe that's about 2 months instead of 3 right now. And then another 3 months for build out. So yeah, from initial conversation, I'm going to look for this certain spot to opening your doors. I would put in your estimation about a year. If you're finding something that's turnkey, second gen location, and you don't need a permit or permitting or build out period, obviously can move quicker. Or if it's a ground up location that doesn't even exist yet, and you can kind of customize it, which is cool, but you're gonna have to wait for it. It could be even longer. So that should give restaurateurs a baseline of what to expect.
Yeah, that's good. And 3 months for build out, depending, that's again, 3 months is what you're looking at. And if you're
Right.
5.5 months, you're pretty good. It's harder, takes longer, costs more money, I think is so important. And so
the one thing I want to mention too about build out is we were talking earlier about TI versus landlord work. You know, what are we asking landlord to do versus what is the tenant going to do and get paid back with on TIs? One advantage of asking for more landlord work is usually your free rent period won't start until you're delivered the space. So if the landlord's responsible for doing the hood, the grease trap, the bathrooms, the HVAC, then deliver the space, then that's when your 5 months or 7 months of free rent clock starts ticking. That's a lot more beneficial than you sign the lease, your free rent clock starts ticking. You know, you're going through permitting, you're going through build out. All of a sudden you're done with your free rent. You're not even open yet.
Right.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. Changes the potential timing. Again, why it's just so important to not only understand each of the individual terminologies that you're dealing with, the clauses that are in the lease, how they feed into each other is also an important thing. So where those dots connect, if you're taking more TI, that then you're outlaying that, but it's going to be reimbursed, but then you have longer to be able to have free rent, that could be the right financial decision for you. So I think that's really great. You need to understand, I'm very big on if then. If we do this, then it means this. And if we do this, then it means this. Everything is interconnected, and you can't look at one clause or one set of fees in and of themselves in a vacuum. And we do that a lot. We're like, all right, I got my CAM, perfect. Yeah, but what that means downstream has a big impact. So again, this is why the communication to me is everything. Communication that you have with your attorney, the communication that you have with Zach, your broker. These are fundamentally important so that you actually understand what it is. Because again, we'll get a little tunnel vision on CAM. I need CAM to be this. Great. What does that mean for everything else? How does that impact the whole ecosystem of your lease, of your property, of the lease term? And that's what we just need to take our time a little bit with this and be diligent with this, which I think is super important. The other thing, Zach, that you mentioned when we're having that first conversation, I think what's very clear, Ken and Doris, and for everybody, we need to have a little bit better first conversation. We need to really understand this as individuals, entrepreneurs, operators, as an industry as a whole. The first conversation, we need to talk about the Chinatown dumplings and give Zach a real good understanding of the economics of it, give him clearly the archetype of your ideal customer. Because he may say, that's Rhino. And I know 4 spots right now that fit everything that you're talking about. And they're 2,500 square feet or 3,000 instead of 6, right? They're the right fit for you. So that then he starts showing you the exact right spots that you need from the get, because we've given him good understanding. And that's what we need to do. Or he might understand those neighborhoods and those potential spaces and the landlords and the potential leases a lot better and say, you know what? I think the Baker neighborhood actually might be better for you based on what you've told me. And you say, okay, well, let's go through that. So you can have a much deeper conversation at the front end is very clear to me. So I appreciate that. So Zach, any last thoughts? Anything else we want to make sure Ken and Doris are aware of? As we know, we're taking a little break looking at real estate, but they're on fire right now. They're going into the virtual kitchen, give them another opportunity to develop their brand, create some more sales, and then still very motivated to look in 2021 is going to be the year of the Chinatown dumpling in Denver, Colorado.
Yes,
that's right.
So what else they need to be thinking about as they reassess and get themselves back into the channel of looking at a brick and mortar location?
Yeah, well, one thing I wanted to mention before I hopped off is that every single deal term is negotiable. We talked a lot about LOI terms. You mentioned TI. Is that something you get reimbursed for, or is landlord going to pay the contractor directly, which is less common, but you can ask for it. Right. So every single deal term, when you think, oh, that doesn't really work that way, it doesn't have to. It's a negotiation. So don't ever think it's black and white. It could always be moved around or repositioned to have a deal that works for you. Ken and Doris, I'm really excited to when we do find that perfect spot. I really think you're going to crush it. Your food is amazing. I'm addicted to it. I think Rhino is a great option for you. I think there could be other great options, but I think I really like that you're kind of taking your time, and it's a better move to be overcautious and really not settle on something and take longer to find that right spot than to sign a lease on something you would regret. So I think you're being wise to really go through it in a diligent manner.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. And Zach, what I'll say is we talk about these industry standards a lot, right? And the churn rate of humans and the churn rate of businesses is ridiculous in this industry. One of the things that I appreciate about you and Broad Street, when I'm glad that you all are together, is because you guys have opened 60 plus restaurants and had maybe a handful close. Your numbers are really strong because I think you take the time and the effort to really think about getting people in the right place, in the right property with the right landlord. Because we talk a lot about LLL, the location. For me, it's landlord, lease, location. Those are the three areas we need to focus on, because there's lots of places that have a great landlord, great lease, and a shit location that are doing crazy numbers because they put themselves in such a strong position that they can market, and they're like this little getaway and there's this destination. So don't only get caught up in location, because landlord, one of the top reasons that restaurants close is because of the lease and the landlord relationship. And so I think it's important. So I appreciate that. And you guys have done a good job of that, Zach, and we'll keep that going. So Zach, appreciate you for the work you've already done with them and for sharing with everybody today. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
All right. Cheers. Have a good one.
See you later.
All right, Ken and Doris, real estate. Whew, it just, there's a lot of anxiety in it, and it doesn't play to our strengths, right? It just fundamentally, it's such a long process. It's so much legalese language. It doesn't feel hospitable. Like, it just doesn't, in and of its nature. It's very cold and clinical, because they want to be exacting and precise and get you the right numbers and get you the right lease and the terms and all of this and the square footage. It's a lot of number crunching and legal language, and you're right, it feels cold. And so if you can find ways to like humanize it through the process, and I think it's having that relationship with the attorney and the broker be really strong from the front end, and be better at telling them your story, and be better at telling them your expectation of the business, of your ideal customer, because I think they can be a much stronger asset sometimes than we give them credit for, because of the fact that the process is so cold. So that's a big takeaway in this. And I really appreciate that you didn't sign the wrong lease. Because
I definitely agree with the just like wanting to move forward, like F it, let's just sign it, we'll figure it out. And I think there's like 2 times that we kind of almost did that, but this whole like what happened with like COVID and us trying to find a space is kind of like a blessing in disguise. We're really glad that it didn't happen, because we would have been in a really bad situation right now.
Yeah, it's interesting. We're in this weird time paradox where everything slowed down. All of a sudden, we have all this time on our hand to reflect on what the hell are we doing here, right? And then at the same time, everything is accelerated, and every technology advancement, delivery, the new ways of communication within the industry, the new styles and expectations of that are 5 years catapulted into the future at the same time. And look, our industry needed disruption in a massive way. The business model of restaurants hasn't changed in over half a century, really. Incremental little things here and there, but we haven't had any exponential growth within the way that we approach this. Now, you better, or you're not going to make it. You have to be a completely different model. It can't just be a different mousetrap to have the same bad behavior. So I really appreciate that you did slow down and put on the brakes. And now you're putting yourself you're in a food hall, you're in a virtual kitchen, brick and mortar. All of a sudden, you have a really dynamic brand that you understand how to communicate and how to thrive in a multifaceted way. Smart. I like it. All right.
Yeah, appreciate that.
Trying.
You feel like you're hanging on for dear life, but apparently it's smart. So good job. All right, Ken, Doris, great. This is we're really catching fire here with a lot of really good tactical things now that I think is important for you all to deploy. So that is it for today's episode. Thanks to both of you, and go make some Chinatown dumplings. I love it.
For sure. Awesome. Thank you.
All right. Cheers. Have a good one. All right, everybody. That is it. Evaluating your 4 walls, not only the 4 walls in a brick and mortar, but what it means for your brand to exist in any given space. Like Ken and Doris have done a great job of giving themselves some stepping stones, getting into that brick and mortar, that more long-term, with the food hall as well as the ghost kitchen model, and then putting themselves in a position to be better operators, to know exactly what they need and want, and put themselves in the best possible position to succeed. That's what we need more of. So this series has been really great, highlighting a lot of both the strengths and vulnerabilities that we have as individuals, operators, as an industry, and the business model, itself. That is it for today. Thank you all, as always, for tuning in. Cheers.